Good afternoon, and welcome to the ALCTS webinar on transitioning from cataloging to creating metadata. I'm Maria Pincus, a virtual member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, and will be your host for this afternoon's webinar. Today's presenters are Teresa Keenan and Vicki Sipe. Teresa Keenan is the head of Bibliographic Management Services in the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Library at the University of Montana. She has written on topics involving cataloging, metadata, and workflow efficiency, and was a key participant in the development of the BibCo standard record for visual materials. Vicki Sipe is the catalog librarian at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, where she has trained staff in everything from serials holdings to descriptive metadata for images. She has presented on working with metadata at ALA Midwinter and several Content DM user group meetings, among others. A few things to keep in mind for today's presentation. GoToWebinar does not have interactive chat capabilities, but if you wish to comment during today's session using Twitter, you may use the hashtag you see on the screen. If you have questions for the presenters, please type them into the box entitled Questions. These will be answered as time permits at the end of the presentation. Questions which remain unanswered while we are on the air will be answered offline, and the responses sent to all attendees. This webinar is being recorded. You should be receiving an email with a link to the recording, the presentation slides, and an evaluation form for the webinar within 2 days. Please take time to fill it out, since it will be useful to the committee for planning future events. Now, as I turn the presentation over to Vicki, there may be a slight delay.
Okay, here we go. Hello, welcome to our webinar, Transitioning from Cataloging to Creating Metadata. Thank you, Maria, for the kind introduction, and thank you to ALCTS for providing us with this opportunity. I'm Vicki Sipe, and this
is Teresa Keenan. And now that you know who we are, Vicki's going to get us started on our presentation.
Yes. Here's what we're going to be covering during the course of the webinar. First off, we're going to talk about why transition to metadata creation. We're going to take a broad look at changes in cataloging with reference to some specific trends. Then we're going to be looking at identifying a project. We'll begin with an overview of what to look for in a project. Then each of us will describe one of our projects and use it as a source for examples. In the training section, we'll begin with some general characteristics of good training, and then each of us will describe training that was needed for our projects. Attitudes will cover common reactions to transitioning from cataloging to metadata creation, with specifics from each of us on how we moved those attitudes forward. And then we'll have we communicated, and that you can use to assist in your own transition to metadata creation. As Maria said, we've planned time at the end for questions, so please feel free to type questions into chat during the presentation or into the question box, and we'll answer them at the end. First up, for us, given the current environment, why haven't you already transitioned to metadata creation becomes the question. Here we have some notable events that demonstrate changes in cataloging here in the recent past. You might recognize the red cover of the IFLA-FRBR report there on the left. It was released in 1998. In December 2004, the first draft of AACR3 was released, and discussion on that soon shifted to RDA, a reconceptualization based on the FRBR principles that had come earlier. By December 2005, the first draft of RDA Part 1 was released, so our content standard was shifting to accommodate a more online FRBRized world. In 2006, you might remember the series decision at the Library of Congress. It created such a hue and cry that the Library of Congress formed the working group on the future of bibliographic control to address changes in how libraries must do their work in the digital information era. Their report, On the Record, appeared in 2008. Among its less controversial recommendations were increase efficiency, repurpose existing metadata, and enhance access to rare, unique, and other special hidden materials. In October 2011, the Library of Congress announced a new initiative to create a replacement for MARC, our library data structure standard, to develop a format that will, among other things, accommodate and distinguish expert, automated, and self-generated metadata. Now, cataloging hasn't changed in a vacuum, but in response to a changing world. We've seen widely available, free, full-text materials, such as in Google Books, become the norm. There have been budget cuts at some of our largest and most prestigious institutions. Among the results have been staffing changes and reorganizations. We've changed our way of working, if not our work. We need to transition from our traditional MARC-encoded cataloging, as you see here, but we need to take with us the skills of describing a resource, creating descriptive metadata, and providing access points to improve discovery of an item. In this case, we're looking at a book entitled Greetings, Carbon-Based Bipeds. It is one of my favorite examples to use. We need to transition into using other metadata standards. This chart shows some of the data standards that are commonly used in libraries to create metadata. You're probably already familiar with many of these standards, so you've already started to make the transition to metadata creation. At least a part of the process of transitioning to metadata creation will be identifying projects where you would create metadata. And here are some characteristics that Therese and I feel will help you identify worthwhile projects. First, unique materials. This is something that helps to justify the project and the effort it will take. The LC report on the record emphasized enhancing access to rare, unique, and other special hidden materials. Next, you'd want to consider the quality of the materials. Remember that unique and high intellectual quality don't necessarily go together. You would prefer a project that is both. Many projects will be pushing content out onto the web. This broadens the access to materials in a profound way. There's not just an increase in access, but a changed nature of access. Some materials might otherwise not be available to the public at all due to their fragile condition. Enhancements offered by digitization, such as a Zoom tool, might increase the value and usability of the materials. And the materials need to be worthy of this kind of exposure. They need to make a real contribution to the broader research community. They need to be of high intellectual quality. Now, collaborations aren't essential, but they can be very valuable. They can extend expertise. They help to share the workload. They help create successful, sustainable metadata projects. You get the benefit of broader expertise and more equipment without needing to add staff or equipment. And sharing the workload might make a project more attractive to you and could also make the project more sustainable for the long run. A project should build on your current skills where possible to save you time and resources, but hopefully expand them as well. You want to reach outside your comfort zone at least a little bit. You want to use your current skills to get the project, to attract collaborators, to get a foot in the door. Then you want to use the open door to learn new skills and open more doors. And of course, stay in scope for your institution. Do we really need to say more about that? The ideal for a project might be a large, ongoing project, something that you can start, train for, and continue with for an extended period of time. Barring that, a series of projects, hopefully with no downtime between them. We're going to spend much of our time today drawing specifics from projects that we've worked on. So please note that though our projects differ, we've often encountered similar issues. And in our case here at UMBC, I'm going to be drawing from our Hughes Company collection of glass negatives. The Hughes Company was a commercial photography business active in Baltimore from the late 1870s until the late 1970s. We have about 3,000 8x10 glass negatives taken from 1905 to 1940. We've scanned around 2,600 of them, processed to positives, uploaded to Content-DM, and have added descriptive metadata. We worked on this project in a collaboration with our Special Collections Department. And here you see a sample of some of our images, some of the larger groups of images that we have in this collection. We have people, places, and things. If you're a fan of Homicide: Life on the Street, you might recognize the Broadway Recreation Pier there on the left. On the right, we have one of my favorite categories of images in this collection, the gizmos. And in this case, we actually know what the gizmo is. Many of our gizmos remain unidentified, and we're hoping some friendly taggers can help us out with that. But in this case, we have a metal melting furnace that was produced by the NonMark Engineering and Manufacturing Company. There were several characteristics that made this project attractive to us. It involved collaboration with our Special Collections Department. The materials are housed there, and the staff there is very familiar with the materials. The collection focuses on historic Baltimore, so there's a very strong local history, public history component. And in that context, these images are original document resources. Negatives, by their very nature, are unique, so we already knew we were dealing with a unique collection. The limited scope and size of the collection proved attractive to decision makers. It was large enough for an experiment, but small enough to be within reach of current resources, primarily money, server space, and staff time. Current staff were trained rather than additional staff hired. Now, generally, these are good quality images, well exposed, and 8x10 glass negatives provide a wealth of detail. Only some of the staff had previously worked with images, so the project built on the skills of those who had to expand the skills of those who hadn't, or provided the excuse to train staff, in my case. Large glass negatives are delicate, and some of these are deteriorating. So this was truly a hidden gem of a collection. The public was never going to be handling these negatives. Additionally, negatives are difficult to read, and processing negatives to positives as part of the digitization process increases the readability and so the usability of the images. The negative on the left becomes the easily readable positive on the right. Even if we had only made the scans available, we would have already added value to the collection. And this is a view of Baltimore's Washington Monument and Mount Vernon Place from about 1914. And I'd like to thank a colleague, Susan Graham, for the photos of the glass negatives. In a collaboration, each partner brings their own skills, tools, and gifts to the table, not unlike our dinner party here on the right from about 1925. Our collaboration was primarily between Special Collections and BMS, the Bibliographic and Metadata Services Department, with assists from Web Services and Library Information Technology Services. The BMS existing competencies included familiarity with bibliographic description standards, editing and creating records. We had an expertise in image work in the department, but it wasn't widely spread, so training was needed but could be done within the department. Department reorganization and downsizing provided us with experience in creating new workflows and streamlining, reworking, and rethinking workflows. The use of controlled vocabularies and name authority files was something that was very familiar to most of the staff, but not all, so there was some training done. Both Special Collections and BMS had demonstrated an ability and willingness to take on new projects in the past. And we had also shown a willingness to work together. Our departments had previously worked on other projects, so we were building on an existing relationship in that case. The workflow was divided with Special Collections handling the negatives, the scanning work, the initial loading of records and images into Content-DM, and initial quality control. The descriptive metadata and other work was then done by a team in BMS. Here's a look at a portion, the descriptive portion of the metadata from a record in Content-DM, the backside where we did the work in the project client. The fields, there were fields with the same information for all records across the collection, and those were supplied with default information on upload in Special Collections. Fields like the photographer, because that was the same throughout the collection. All images were given a date created range from 1905 to 1940 as a default. There were notes that were provided about the processing of the positive, etc. BMS staff then constructed titles, provided free text description as necessary, determined if the image was associated with a location and what that location was, supplied controlled vocabulary, as in the subject fields towards the bottom, and we also performed additional quality control. We checked dates, orientation of the image, spelling, etc. We hope to use the location information, eventually the mappable field here, in another project where we might map the images to Baltimore city streets. In this case, in the description field, you can see we've indicated an intersection. At some future date, we might actually go ahead and drop in the GPS coordinates. Staff working on the project in BMS were copy catalogers, a DBM technician, and an acquisition technician. So now Teresa is going to introduce you to her project.
Thank you. Like Vicky's group, we had an opportunity to become part of a great digitization project. The goal of our Natives of Montana archival project, or NOMAP as it became known to locally, is to provide access to primary source documents about indigenous peoples of Montana. The documents we are scanning are maintained by the National Archives in Washington, D.C. We began work on NOMAP during the summer of 2009 and will continue on a year-by-year basis as long as funding is available. This project was made possible because of a collaboration between the Native American Studies program at the University of Montana, the Native American program at the National Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian Institution, the Marine and Mike Mansfield Library, and the Montana Memory Project. As of today, there are more than 86,000 images that have been processed and are available to the public, and we expect to process another 17,000+ images this year. Next, please. Vicki mentioned earlier that one of the key things to consider when looking at a project is scope. You want to choose a project that can be completed with your available resources. When our project was first proposed, the Native American Studies researchers identified more than 2 million relevant documents. That fact alone could have been a huge red flag for not even starting this project. We determined, however, that it was important enough to digitize these materials, so we created boundaries for the collection based on subject areas and available funding. Some of the reasons that we chose to pursue this project included the collaborative nature. We felt that this would highlight the skills of different departments within the library and open doors to future projects. This collection was of scholarly interest for teaching and research at the University of Montana, and it was of historical interest to the local community and state. A fun example of this is the story related to the images pictured here. The West Wolf family lived in the house pictured on the left, and they moved into the shack pictured on the right later on because they thought the previous building was haunted. The collection also fits the scope of both the library and digital project's mission statements because the material will enhance the understanding of the environmental, social, and cultural histories of western Montana. Finally, this project was special because it will provide access to primary resources not otherwise available outside of Washington, D.C. Next, please. I mentioned earlier that this project provided an opportunity to highlight the skills of staff within BMS and share our expertise with the rest of the library, as well as teaching departments on campus. Some of these skills included the technical skills to edit and format images and change file formats, data entry and attention to detail. We're practiced at following standards and providing descriptive metadata. We're experienced with organizing information, and we're experienced with assigning Library of Congress subject headings and authority control of names. The addition of the expertise from BMS made the final product more accessible and useful to researchers without significantly delaying the planned timeline of the project. Next. While BMS has become an integral part of this project, it did not start out that way. The workflow has evolved over the years. With each iteration, the role of BMS has increased, and the current progress begins with the researchers and graduate students in the Native American Studies Department who identify materials to be digitized and capture the digital images with minimal metadata. The digital production staff and students within BMS do all the post-processing of images, while the cataloging staff create the descriptive metadata. Cataloging technicians then combine the files and load the digital objects into Content DM. Cataloging staff and faculty also provide the final quality control of the materials, and then the Montana Memory Project hosts the collection, making it freely available to the public and providing preservation of the collection overall. Now that we have discussed some of the reasons for becoming involved with digitization projects and examined some of the criteria that should be reviewed prior to taking on a project, Vicki's going to tell us about how important training is to a successful project.
Though our focus was to build on existing skills as much as possible, people were taking on new tasks and training was necessary. And hopefully none of it was quite as deadly as the image that we have here of a pretty staid classroom in about 1927. So once again from the Hughes collection. Teresa and I agree that all good training has several things in common. Good communication, regular, inclusive by many methods, some synchronous, such as group meetings, some asynchronous, such as emails, websites, and wikis. Good documentation, readily available, convenient to anyone at any time, can answer many questions. It also assists in consistency between catalogers and projects. Building on existing skills. We say this a lot. You don't always have to start from zero. It can be a time and money saver as well as a morale boost to acknowledge existing expertise. And don't forget that last. Using a training cycle such as train, review, feedback, repeat can be very effective, and I'm sure you've all used something similar, especially the repeat part. You want to provide training using a variety of methods. Different people learn in different ways. Some need to hear it, some see it, some read it, and all benefit from doing it. With training, don't reinvent the wheel. Use outside tools such as YouTube videos. Some software companies provide videos and even program learning packages. Don't forget the in-house expertise. It might save you money, but once again, recognizing in-house expertise can be a morale boost. Specific training that you might find helpful in transitioning to work on metadata creation might include training on new software, or more likely, software new to some people. I'm sure you can already see some software packages here that you're familiar with. Training in the use of new technologies, and training on new data standards. You might be tempted to create an entirely local set of standards, but we strongly suggest that you consider using existing standards. The value of shared standards would be yet another lesson that we've learned from working in our cataloging world. For data structures, you might use Dublin Core or EAD. For content or descriptive standards, you might use DAX, graphic materials, or even one you might already be learning, RDA. Next, we're going to each speak about training that we needed for our projects. For the Hughes project, most of our staff was new to working with images. Providing descriptive metadata for images requires that you learn to read an image, that you become visually literate, at least to some extent. This exercise was done individually, and then we discussed what each person found. We would study the image, we would list what it shows or depicts, and then as a broad topic, what it shows or depicts, and then list everything that you see in the image. Write a short descriptive title, and here you might capture a process or an event that you believe is depicted. In other words, the sum of the parts of the image that you earlier listed. In this specific case, we have the Wells and McComas Monument in Baltimore. It commemorates American soldiers Daniel Wells and Henry McComas, who died during the Battle of North Point, September 12, 1814. We celebrate the successful defense of Baltimore on Defenders Day. It's a state holiday. We don't know the exact date the image was made, but by virtue of its being a part of the Hughes collection, we know it was made between 1905 and 1940. Subject analysis is key to cataloging and metadata creation. This three-subject method from Heidi Lee Horman is particularly useful in considering the subject of images. For thingness, you might think of it as the physical form of the image, and in this case, we have a black and white photograph from a gelatin dry plate negative. For ofness, that would be the who, what, when, and where are shown or depicted in the image. And in this case, we're looking at a monument set in a cityscape. We see some bunting, a few electric lights, and commercial buildings in the background. Aboutness you can think of as probably the most abstract and often the most difficult to capture. This image is pretty clearly about the soldiers Daniel Wells and Henry McComas, the Battle of North Point, Baltimore in history, but it might also be about sacrifice, those two soldiers killed in battle. In fact, they're buried under this monument. It might be about victory. The bunting might suggest a celebration, perhaps a Defenders Day celebration, but in this case we really can't be sure of that. To translate analysis into subject access, we used controlled vocabulary, a skill very familiar to catalogers. TGM was a new vocabulary, the thesaurus for graphic materials. It was a new vocabulary for our copy catalogers, but controlled vocabulary and subject headings were familiar. So again, we built on the familiar to introduce a new tool. For those of you not familiar with TGM, it was developed by the Library of Congress to augment the Library of Congress subject headings for their prints and photographs division. It was developed specifically to fit the visual resources in those collections. Like LCSH, the terms are based on warrant, so someone would have needed the term to describe an item in a collection in order to be included in the thesaurus. Everyone in our project was new to working in Content EM, and we entered our descriptive data directly into records using the Content EM client. So there were several group training sessions, and OCLC online tutorials were used as well. We captured the names of businesses, as indicated here, AD Royals, and individuals, as we came across them. This example is, of course, a personal name. And then we would add those names to our subject names field. We would search the names first in the OCLC name authority files, and many of our staff were experienced in this. Some weren't, so there was training provided on that. Those names not found in the name authority files were added to a local names list that was built in Content-EM and served as a controlled vocabulary. Documentation included such things as a data dictionary to explain what data using which standard would be entered into which field. This particular data dictionary was used by copy catalogers for guidance on how to choose terms and included examples. Methods for training used for the Hughes collection included group trainings. These were generally PowerPoint presentations with exercises and discussions. Topics included both concepts and specific tools. We had sessions on visual literacy and subject analysis, and also sessions on tools such as searching TGM, searching OCLC authorities, and working in Content-EM. And again, we used some Content-EM tutorials, OCLC tutorials, for training on Content-EM. Documentation was discussed in group meetings, was used in exercises, and posted for ready access. The data dictionary and a field-by-field best practices guide covered all the descriptive metadata fields with fairly detailed information. There were also narrowly focused best practice guides for specific types of images, types where we had large groupings of images such as churches, monuments, and portraits. Then each person began work on an individual initial set of carefully selected images with a short timeline for turnaround. There was one-on-one feedback and group discussion on common issues in these sets. After the initial set, there was ongoing review and feedback of work with follow-up group work as needed. Now Teresa is going to talk about the training that they went through in her institution.
Like Vicky's group, we discovered that our project required additional training, and we also used a variety of instruction methods. We ran into similar training needs, so I'll not go into much detail on those. I will focus more on the details that were unique to our particular situation. Training requirements depended on the current skills and knowledge of the individual, as well as which part of the project they were going to be working with. Training for graduate students focused on technical issues related to photography, as well as minimal metadata instruction, while training for catalogers concentrated on applying their cataloging skills in new ways and learning new software protocols. Next. Early on, we discovered that the graduate students needed more than an introduction to specific camera equipment they were using. As you can see from the sample of images here, additional instruction on the importance of consistency in lighting, levels, orientation, and the impact of including fingers and other extra materials in the images was required in order to better streamline the post-processing and to improve the overall quality of the final image. Next. The materials that we are digitizing are all stored in folders inside archival boxes and are organized roughly according to date, agency, and record group. Each record group generally consists of materials about a single subject, such as education or land use. When the materials were removed from the containers and photographed, much of the contextual information was potentially lost. As you can see from the examples on this page, it can be difficult to describe an item with little or no context. So we train the students to capture minimal metadata, such as box numbers, folder numbers, record group numbers, and any other observation about the order or relationship of the materials to one another. This additional training was well worth the time, because without the additional information, our catalogers would have had a hard time figuring out that the newspaper pictured here was an article from the Great Falls Tribune on October 24, 1940, and that the image on the right was actually the front of a postcard. Next. Because the collection consisted of a large variety of types of materials, catalogers had to be trained to identify both what the object was and what it was about. Some things are similar to what they are used to working with, like maps and textual materials shown here, and so they needed very little extra explanation. Next. And some of the things that they worked with were very different from what our catalogers are used to describing. The pink charge slip pictured in the center here proved to be particularly troublesome until we figured out what it even was. Catalogers had to be trained to look at the images, determine what it was about, and then make decisions on how best to describe the materials in the images so that the relationship with one another would be apparent to the end user. During the training process, we identified and created a number of resources and tools to aid the catalogers in their work. Next slide, please. Some of these tools included data dictionaries and step-by-step instructions for entering metadata for different types of images. That information was kept on our webpage where people could access it anytime. Directories, like the one pictured here for the commissioners, were very useful for helping people decipher handwritten names, as well as the resource such as the family history reference also provided information on traditional Indian names that we were unfamiliar with working. The Library of Congress name authority files and local authority lists that we created were helpful for consistency with names. And the most important tool that we created actually was an FAQ. That became very important as we moved through the project. We discovered different types of images and different questions came up that we hadn't anticipated at the beginning. In addition to these new ancillary tools, our catalogers had to learn how to work within different software environments. Next, please. Due to the large number of files and the way we plan to load the images into Content DM, we chose to enter our metadata into an Access database rather than directly into Content DM. Like Vicki, we also capitalized on existing skills and parsed out responsibilities so that everyone would learn new things and hopefully no one would be completely overwhelmed. Some people entered descriptive data into a form, like the one pictured here, which made it possible for people with little knowledge of Access to participate, and while others exported that data, reformatted it, and combined it with the image and OCR files, and then loaded that into Content DM. Even though our training efforts were quite successful, we did encounter a few stumbling blocks along the way. Vicki is going to tell us about a few of those and how they can be overcome.
Teresa and I encountered very similar attitudes towards the transition to metadata creation, and we've come to share the opinion that it's all in how you look at it. Is it faces or is it a vase? It really does depend on how you look at it. So we're going to each talk about a few of them here in this section, and hopefully provide you with some methods to make the attitudes useful. To many people, cataloging is creating bibliographic records using MARC 21 as a data structure and AACR2 as a data content structure. Catalogers only work in the catalog. When you create a bibliographic record to represent an item, you are creating metadata, data about data. The skills you use to create such a record can be used to create descriptive metadata in other contexts using other standards. Subject analysis, attention to detail, the use of controlled vocabularies, and the application of standards are all skills that transcend a single context and qualify you for metadata creation rather than restrict you to cataloging. There were a variety of attitudes around controlled vocabularies. For some, controlled vocabulary for description was seen as insufficient, unnecessarily restrictive. It just didn't fit. Encouraging the use of synonyms in free text fields, such as the title field and description field, seemed to help. The synonyms were then retrievable via keyword searching. Also, a discussion of the recognized value of controlled vocabulary in searching was helpful. Among those value-added qualities is the increase in precision of search results. Controlled vocabulary decreases false drops, and more of the material retrieved in search results is relevant material. Consistency of search results across collection and across institutions is another benefit of the use of controlled vocabulary, and we've listed several of those benefits here on the left-hand side of the screen. On the right-hand side of the screen, we found that even taking a controlled vocabulary term to a Google search results in increased precision. On the right, Googling on the TGM term, tombs and sepulchral monuments, returns a highly relevant list of materials in such collections as the Library of Congress and the New York Public Library. Your collection could be an excellent company as the result of such a search. The perception of non-MARC work as less than cataloging took a variety of forms. It's bad cataloging. If it's not MARC, it's not cataloging. If it's not on OCLC, it's just not cataloged. In reality, the non-MARC record on the upper left is not so very different from the OCLC record for the same item on the lower right. The records describe the same physical item in many of the same terms, allowing retrieval by format, among others. Both records provide access points for the photographer and subjects depicted, and this is by design. We take the values of cataloging into the creation of metadata. Our Google search on tombs and sepulchral monuments returns over 1 million results. In the MARC world, we retrieve many fewer items. The non-MARC world is a much larger world with a larger audience than the MARC world. I think we all realize that. And this metadata world is where we want our collections to be accessible to the public. One of the dangers on training visual literacy with a tool such as list everything you see in the image is the problem of getting a shopping list of terms to describe that image when you go to assign the subject headings and the subject terms. A kind of leveling of the importance of anything and everything in an image. A tendency to forget that the whole might be greater than the sum of its parts. In the interest of time, how many subject headings really can you apply to a single image, and meeting the expectations of a potential user, we focused on using terms at the level of specificity of the item, another very common concept and very familiar to catalogers. Someone searching for windows might expect to see the image on the lower right in their search results, rather than the image on the upper left. Another consideration might be the ALCTS focus on major subjects. Subject headings are generally selected for topics that represent at least 20% of an item. At some later date, we might decide that some of our images need to be indexed, and at that time we might go back to an image such as this house on the upper left and look to assign terms providing retrieval on noteworthy architectural details or features. But for that first cut through, we want to look at the level of specificity of the item. Not all of our work on attitudes should be reactive. We look for buildings on Google Street View, at least in part, to verify location in our project. Especially in the initial training set of images, I assigned images of buildings and monuments that I found still standing in Google Street View. Here we had a 1927 view of Baltimore on the upper left, featuring a water tower built by the Baltimore Cooperage Company. And on the right, we have a Google Street View. Taking the time to build in the I found it moment for staff was well worth the time it took to identify a few of these images. So build the good attitudes as well as react to the counterproductive ones is something that I've found to be quite useful. Now Teresa will speak about some of the attitudes she encountered and tools that she used to address them.
In addition to some of the things Vicki already described for you, we ran into some different issues that I'd like to share. Some of our biggest issues revolved around the concept of time. The timing of training was a big one. We provided training for catalogers in Dublin Core and data dictionaries and how that related to AACR2, as well as with Content DM and Microsoft Access. And then our project was delayed. By the time we got around to working on it, people forgot what they had learned, so we had to redo much of our initial training. The other difficulty we had was actually making time to work on the project itself. We had many volunteers at first. However, when it came down to it, some people were not willing to sacrifice productivity in other areas to do metadata for something new. Incorporating metadata responsibilities into official job descriptions and providing open, clear communication on expectations helped us overcome that issue. Next. Next. Okay. Even though we provided training, it took some time to develop good judgment about just how much information to provide for an image. Many of the documents we dealt with were handwritten, and while it would be nice to be able to provide full text searching for everything, that was not a sustainable option given our resources. We had to convince people that they really didn't need to transcribe the entire document. They just had to include enough information so that someone will understand what the image is about and will be able to find it using common search terms like the dates, names, people, dates and names of people and places. Next. So in addition to determining what's good enough, we ran into the mindset that metadata work is not as important as traditional work. It was different, and doing metadata meant doing less traditional cataloging. For some, the lack of physical materials moving on and off a person's desk gave the false impression that they were not really accomplishing much with their time and effort. Some of the things we did to build enthusiasm for our project included sharing the final product when a group of objects went public. We also shared feedback from researchers who were actually using the collection. And throughout the project, we would remind people that the work they were doing was creating worldwide access to a collection of materials that were previously only available to those few who could afford to travel to Washington, D.C. Some of this information made a huge impact on some of our doubters. Additionally, we sent weekly updates out to everyone working on the project as well as their supervisors. It was a way of patting them on the back for a job well done and indicating just how much they had completed, and this turned out to be very successful for us. As you can see from the example in the slide, we used a pie chart to display how much had been completed versus what was left. Individual names were not used because we did not want to publicly point fingers at any one individual. Even so, people knew which slice of the pie represented their work. And an unanticipated outcome was that this actually created a little bit of friendly competition with some staff members trying to make their slice of the pie larger than the other slices the next time the report came out. Another attitude that we ran across was the assumption that once something is cataloged, it's done and you really never have to revisit it. Our NonMark project provided a great example of how this is not always the case. As our project expanded over the years and additional expertise was brought in, we discovered that some of the metadata could be improved along the way. For example, the very first year, the date field was not entered using ISO standards. This made it so that the collection itself was not sortable by date. So we've gone back through and re-entered the metadata for the date field on all of those, and now the entire collection can be filtered by date. Additionally, we got information from our archivist and feedback about the nature of the collection itself, how it's actually used by researchers. This also changed the way we wanted to create the title, as well as the way we structured the actual objects themselves. By redoing this, taking the time to redo this metadata, we've made the collection much more accessible and usable in the long run. And so now that you have heard some examples of how both of our institutions dealt with incorporating metadata work into traditional cataloging units, Vicki's going to wrap things up for us.
So, in closing, here's some points that we hope that you can take away from our presentation. We'd like to re-emphasize a few of them here. So, right up top, we would encourage you to pick the project carefully. Look at unique materials, look for high intellectual quality, and if at all possible, look for collaborations to stretch your resources and to add to your current resources without expending things that you don't have. Assess the present skills of your staff. You might be surprised to find not only there are people who don't understand some things that you thought they did, but there are also folks who understand some things you had no idea they understood. Both of those can be very valuable to put together a solid training program. When you provide training, be clear and be sure to provide for many different learning styles, to build on existing skills when at all possible, and to repeat as needed. And I guess I would add here as well, look for those outside resources that you might be able to make use of. Good communication is always important, but when you're initiating a new workflow or a new project, regular, inclusive, and communication by as many methods as possible is very important. And for documentation, make sure it's readily available. You don't want folks coming up with questions that they might have been able to answer themselves if that documentation had been available to them from a website or a wiki. Overall, our projects were very different, but I hope that you can see that we encountered many of the same issues, and we hope that our experiences can assist you in your own projects. We're going to look to include some questions here. We also want to note that we're making a selected bibliography available. It's about 2.5 pages of articles that one or both of us have used in putting together this work or working on the projects that we've selected to talk to you about today. It will be posted with the slides and with the recording of the presentation. So let me just put up this slide for our questions. Teresa, I don't know if you have anything else that you might like to add?
Not necessarily.
Okay, and Maria was going to
I don't see any questions here right now.
Okay.
If anybody wants to write one in, please go ahead. Feel free to.
I could add, just while we're waiting for some questions to come in, we had both mentioned the early on about projects being, the scope of projects and being useful information as well as information that's not easily attainable otherwise. And I just have a fun story to share. While we were doing our project, we had the assistance of some of our reference technicians who were also helping us do metadata at one point. And one of our reference assistants, who, unknown to me, was of Native American descent. And as she was doing descriptive metadata for some images in our collection, she actually ran into some old photographs of relatives of hers. And so it really put a personal touch on the project for her. So I just thought it was kind of a fun thing to share.
Well, we have had several questions come in. The first one is, do you have suggestions? And there's so many that are filling my box, I've got to look up to see it again. Wait a minute. Oh my gosh, I've got to make my box nice and big because I've lost first questions. Oh, here we go. Do you have suggestions for an alternative to Content DM, one that is free?
Oh, I don't. Do you, Teresa?
We've done a few things using, or our archives department has done a few things using Omeka, and I believe that that is free software.
Well, maybe at a very basic level it's free, but
okay.
We've actually subscribed to Omeka. But there are several institutions, and we've put some of our Hughes images up on Flickr. So,
right.
And you can add metadata to images there. You can upload images, and there are several. I forget what the limits are on the amount of material you can put up on a free one, but you could certainly look to something like that. And that's certainly a platform that many people use and are familiar with. So, but I'm sorry, it doesn't appear like we've got too much to offer on that.
Yeah.
Another question is, what sort of administrative support was provided for the training?
In our case at UMBC, much of the training that we did was in-house. So as far as administrative support, that would be my time available to put together a training session, or when we used OCLC tutorials, time for the people who were working on the project to be able to view those tutorials, to take time away from their other workload. So I guess in terms of training, it would just have to be the tacit agreement from administration that time was available to do those kinds of activities.
In addition to time, our administration did also provide some funding for paid for webinars related to content. No, Content DM was free, but some Dublin Core webinars and things like that. We did have administrative support to help pay for some of that training.
And just, I would add that I don't think we've ever had a request for paid training turned down by our administration, especially if it's something in the form of webinars. Let me qualify that. If we're talking about webinars where many people can attend one webinar such as this, we have never had one of those turned down by our administration. So we've received a great deal of support from library administration in that way, and it's been very helpful.
Can you talk a bit more about how you shared the metadata you created for your projects with the wider online world?
Okay, one of the ways we're doing that is through this webinar, but specifically the metadata for our images, Content DM, of course, is a publicly searchable interface when we take it public, so it can be searched in that way. Just as an aside, a story connected with our Hughes collection, we have about 3,000 of these glass negatives, the Hughes collection, but at the time that the company closed and the images were distributed, there was another local institution that has now come to hold about 36,000 Hughes images. They've not been able to spend the time to do the individual item level description that we've been able to do. So one of the things that I've been in conversation with them about is the possibility of sharing our metadata with them so that we can maybe do a matchup between, see, where we have one image of Baltimore's Washington Monument, they may have 50 images of Baltimore's Washington Monument. So if we can work out a project whereby we could share our metadata with them on images that are similar in content, we might be able to make their collection also accessible to the public. So that might be one way that we could share our metadata to a broader public.
Right. Some of the ways we're looking at for sharing our metadata are because our collection is being hosted by OCLC in Content DM. There's a mechanism in place that you can harvest the metadata and create collection level records so that they're available in OCLC as well. So that distributes the metadata to a wider audience. As far as advertisement for the collection itself, there's been a lot of just word of mouth here on campus. Professors using the collection for classes and that type of thing, and scholars chatting with one another when they find a good resource. So those are some of the avenues we've been pursuing.
How many people are devoted to metadata versus cataloging? That distinction can be made.
At our institution, everybody does it all. So we don't have a distinct metadata unit. And we have people who are not copy catalogers who have also done it. Our database maintenance technician who was involved in doing descriptive metadata had done some cataloging, so she actually kind of came from that side. But we had at least one acquisitions technician who was involved who had not previously done descriptive bibliographic work, but obviously working in acquisitions was very familiar with bibliographic records and the content. We also had, at one point, I had a student who did some review of some of the work and helped to add to some of the work that was done by copy catalogers. But that was a student who had already been doing copy cataloging for us on another project.
Right. We have a similar situation at our institution. All of the people who were working on this project within BMS also do cataloging work. So those who do metadata do cataloging. The exception to that point would be the technicians who work specifically on the image creation and reformatting of images and things like that. And as I mentioned on the aside earlier, we did also have the assistance of some reference technicians who had done other, mostly spend most of the time doing reference-related work, but have had some experience helping with projects in BMS as well. So.
And if we're going to talk about the broader metadata, special collections staff and personnel dealt with the administrative, preservation, and rights metadata portions of the records. So, and while none of those individuals are catalogers per se, they had also had quite a bit of exposure to bibliographic records and that type of information. So.
Very related to this question, what percentage of departmental time do you plan to dedicate to these types of projects, and do you anticipate your traditional cataloging workload to diminish?
I'll take that up first. I would like to devote as much time as possible to this type of metadata work. I have a particular bias here. I'm not only a history buff, but an amateur photographer. So this is Vicki. So if I can spend more time, the maximum amount of time I could possibly spend on this would be my waking hours, and I would not make me unhappy. I come out of a traditional cataloging background, and I love doing descriptive work on all manner of materials. I don't see our traditional cataloging workload disappearing ever, not at this point. I think of it much as I think of the paperless society that was promised to us, I think, beginning in the 1950s. I don't see the traditional cataloging workload disappearing, and I see this work as a natural extension of the traditional cataloging work that I've been involved in up to this point. And I don't want to give up the traditional cataloging because there's a whole bunch of stuff out there that I have yet to work on or describe, and we still do have things sitting around waiting for my attention. So it's a kind of a devil's deal. You know, there's too much. I view it as job security. There's always plenty of work to be done, and that's a happy place to be in. So I don't know if Teresa wants to.
Pretty much the same ideas with that. I think it's an extension of what we're already doing. I think that our traditional cataloging efforts that we do will continue as long as there are physical objects that the library collects. And so I think it's, as far as percentage of time dedicated, to one or the other. I think that that's mostly going to be determined by what our priorities are within the library and our collections development and that type of thing as to what kind of collections we choose to gather in the future. So.
I did see a quick question run by that I just wanted to answer. Somebody asked what the names of our dogs were. And my dog on the right, the redhead, that's Gracie. And Teresa?
And the white puffball on the left is Louie.
I didn't want to let that one get missed. So.
Let me see. I'm trying to see. There's going to be there's going to be a good amount we're going to have to answer offline. And that's good that we have a good amount of questions. But let me see. How did you train staff in visual literacy?
I've used a variety of techniques. One is that small exercise that I put up on, I forget the slide number, but it's one of the slides with the Wells and McComas monument on it. And it's an adaptation of a technique used by many people who work with digital collections with images. And if you go to the Library of Congress Prints and Photographs Division pages, there's a page of cataloging resources. And Helena Zinkum has done some really excellent work on training for visual literacy in this very narrow sense. I think I don't want to misuse the term. Visual literacy is a very broad idea that encompasses everything from copyright to anything else you can think of about image use. But in this particular case, I'm taking visual literacy to mean the reading of an image. So that's one exercise that I've used. There's another exercise that I've used where I give folks a group of images and ask them to sort the images into groups, into like groups, and define the like group. And then within the group, define what differentiates between the images. And this is meant to get people at both the co-location based on similar things within an image, as well as the differentiation between similar things. And this goes directly to subject analysis. And you're going to find in working with images that not everyone relates equally well to reading an image. To some people, it just comes naturally. They look at an image and they see the pieces. Other folks look at an image and they see, so to speak, the bigger picture. They can see the process that's depicted, but maybe not the details of the picture. And other folks, when they look at a picture, a black and white photograph, they see a black and white photograph. So it's a skill that can be developed. And there are, as I say, the Library of Congress Prints and Photographs Division has a really wonderful page of resources for this. And there are several, if you just Google visual literacy, you're going to come up with a plethora of resources on how to do this.
Okay, well, we're almost running out of time, so as I said, the many other questions we have here will be answered offline by the presenters. I just wanted to conclude with some thank yous, and let's see. Okay, here we go. This is some upcoming ALCTS continuing education opportunities. So thank you, Teresa and Vicki, for guiding us through the necessary steps for transitioning from cataloging to creating metadata. And our thanks go as well to each of you attending this webinar today. If you have an idea for a webinar, feel free to submit a proposal using the online form found on the ALCTS website. ALCTS offers an array of online learning opportunities. As I said, you can see them here on the screen, and these include some web courses of 4 weeks duration besides our webinars, and the committee also schedules e-forums free of charge on a monthly basis for ALCTS members as well as non-members. Please visit the ALCTS website for details about all our continuing education offerings. As we conclude this afternoon's broadcast, I would like to thank Jane Rosario and Eva Sorrell, members of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee's Technical Support Subcommittee, as well as Julie Reese and Vicki Gruzinski in the ALCTS office for their assistance. We hope that this webinar has been of interest to you and look forward to welcoming you at another ALCTS webinar in the future.